on the recorder is on. So.
Okay, we're going to continue our meeting. And Council, if you could report out from closed session, please.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. The Board of Supervisors met in closed session to discuss agenda items number 19 and 20 on today's agenda. The Board met and conferred with its labor negotiators on agenda item number 19. Those negotiators are Allison Hauk, Dana Torres-Wong, Ray Espinoza, Joe Paul Gonzalez, Melinda Casillas, Georgia Cochran, and Steve Coffey. The employee organizations discussed were Institutions Association, Law Enforcement Management, Management Employees Group, SEIU Local 529, the General Unit Employees, SEIU Local 2015, Deputy Sheriff's Association, Confidential Employees, Confidential Management Employees, Department Heads, and Unrepresented Employees. The authority to meet can be found in California Government Code Section 54957.6. At this time, the Board took no reportable action. Finally, agenda item number 20, the Board met and conferred with its legal counsel regarding anticipated litigation and the initiation of litigation pursuant to subdivision D4 of Section 54956.9 in one case. At this time, the Board took no reportable action. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And we'll go to item number 18. And Council,
yes,
will you
thank
please
you, Madam
introduce
Chair.
this item?
Right. We have with us today from CSAC and the Paul Smith, who is the Senior Legislative Advocate for the Rural County Representatives of California. And we also have Ms. Karen Keene from CSAC, and she is also a legislative analyst or legislative representative. They are going to discuss with the Board today the most recent legislation coming out of Sacramento that addresses marijuana cultivation. There were three bills recently passed. As far as I know, the governor had not yet signed them, but at some point, I think if he fails to sign them, they automatically become law. Perhaps we'll get an update on that. And then we are going to, once the presentation is done, we will come back and examine our own ordinance, which was adopted at the last meeting, which needs to be voted on again for final acceptance on today. That would be the ordinance number 939, which would add a new chapter 11.15 to the San Benito County Code, restricting and regulating marijuana cultivation within San Benito County.
And correction, they're RCRC representatives.
Correction, Paul Smith is from RCRC and Karen Keene is from CSAC.
Just welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we welcome your information, and you've got the floor.
Good morning, Madam Chair. Thank you very much for the introduction. Yes, Paul Smith, Rural County Representatives, Senior Legislative Advocate, and my colleague, Karen Keene from CSAC. We are not twins, although we dress like that, but, you know, we did not exchange memos last night in terms of our attire, but we are happy to be here and look forward to the conversation. I'm going to walk through a portion of the presentation and then turn it over to my colleague to talk about others, and then we'll intermix. And then I would encourage members of the board to interject at your will with questions or comments about this. We'll try to go through it rather quickly because I know you have some business, and I know you'll have some questions, perhaps also from county staff. I believe you have a copy of the PowerPoint presentation we're going to go through. Also, you should have a chart that we brought from Sacramento. This is a very, very helpful reference chart as relates to the bill package, and we brought extra copies for the public as well. And encourage the disbursement of that. So go ahead and start the program. I may, if you don't mind, Madam Chair, I may come a little out here to see what's going on. I'm not usually used to that. I first want to start off the presentation as I've done previously and thank some other folks who are not in the room and make this board aware, as other boards, that in addition to RCRC and CSAC working on this, There were some others, and I always want to thank them. Jolina Voorhuris of the Urban Counties Caucus, another organization, a sister organization of CSAC and RCRC. A few supervisors, your colleagues in other counties, Supervisor Doug Teeter of Butte, Supervisor Bob Williams of Tehama, Supervisor Judy Morris of Trinity. And then we could not have done the work we did without some staff help on this package. Arthur Wyleen, County Counsel in Tehama, Christina Robb, Assistant County Counsel in County of San Bernardino, and then finally from a staff perspective, CAO Carmel Angelo from Mendocino County. All were very helpful to all three organizations, and you'll see why when we get into this presentation. Also, we work very closely and collaboratively with other county organizations such as the Ag Commissioners, Environmental Health Directors, and County Health Executives Association of California. Let me step back, if I can here. It's kind of awkward in terms of highlighting what's on the board. 3 years ago, Karen and I were walking the halls at the very end of session, and we were lobbying against a bill at that time which would have created a medical marijuana regulatory framework. And we were successful in defeating that bill on the last night of session. It never came up for a vote. We kind of worked behind the scenes to make sure that didn't happen. But I think at the end of that interlude, we looked at each other and we said, we've been saying no for a long time on medical marijuana. I think it would be wise for us to start thinking of a pathway to saying yes. In other words, if medical marijuana is what it is, and I think both of our respective memberships are having issues in respective counties, we need to figure out a better way. And we were also mindful that we could somehow see a ballot measure on the recreational side at some point. So our respective organizations went kind of back to our memberships and folks and started thinking about, okay, what can we live with a medical marijuana regulatory framework? I will say at the utmost for the public and for this board, and Karen can add to this later, our board's position, RCRC board, the CSAC board, is not about for or against medical marijuana or marijuana in general. It's about how a medical marijuana framework is constructed and what do counties need in that structure. And that's what we have been advocating. We are not for or against or urging this board to adopt this ordinance or any ordinance for that matter. You will see that these principles simply reflect what counties need in a medical marijuana regulatory framework. And that's done in RCRC by adopting a variety of policy principles, which the board did, and I know Supervisor Patello was very active in those conversations, and our board did that as such. And obviously you can see that CSAC has done the same with adopting some policy principles. Again, what do counties need in a medical marijuana framework to make it work for their locality? By and large, these were the four principles that kind of guided us and became the main items that we needed. Obviously, preserving local control. You're about to exercise that later today by approving an ordinance. That was first and foremost. If you did not retain your land use authority, counties would oppose, counties would walk away, and we would continue to have this fight that we've had over several years. So preserving local land use control, without a doubt, was paramount. Explicit county taxing authority was the second one. A lot of people scratch their head as to what does this mean. And this is really, really important, particularly for small cultivating counties. And basically what it says is we needed to put in the statute a specific reference that county boards of supervisors have the ability to levy taxes associated with medical marijuana at the local level, i.e. a cultivation tax. Why would we do this? Don't counties already have this authority? The answer is yes, they already have that authority, but we anticipate a fair amount of litigation in the use of that authority. And what this provision, as you'll see referenced, it turns a 7-year lawsuit into a 2-year lawsuit, meaning it makes a cultivation tax workable. And I always am mindful of the county of Trinity County, 14,000 people, massive amounts of acreage cultivating marijuana. If it were to get bogged down in a lawsuit, any cultivation tax it would enact would be meaningless because it would all be spent on defending their their ordinance and their cultivation tax. So if we minimize that litigation, we can actually see the proceeds and do what a Board of Supervisors terms doing. I will also add that this provision that you would see in the package does not change the process for approving taxes. That's very, very important. All it does is explicitly say that you can adopt taxes as it relates to this industry. There is a variety of options that your board would have to use. The next one is ending the collective model. And that is basically the issue of having a licensed system statewide, a regulatory system, a licensing system, particularly for the industry players. The collective model, in our opinion, the county opinion, is not really worth the paper it's written on, to be frank. And so we wanted to go to a fully licensing scheme. And then finally, addressing the environmental impacts. By far another huge issue for cultivating counties. You all know the horror stories. I'm sure that those folks have come before this board and explained them to you, both, whether it's county staff, members of the public, et cetera. We need to do something to deal with the environmental impacts, water, pesticide use, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the four main principles. I don't want to leave you with the idea that that's all we cared about in this package. As you will see, that's not. But those are the four guiding principles that all of our organizations worked very hard to secure. So we have a three-bill package, as Matthew had indicated. Those three bills sit on the governor's desk right now. We expect him to sign it. He has until midnight the 11th, which I believe is Sunday night, to decide on what to do with these bills. Under California law, if the governor does not sign the bills and nor does he veto them, they become law without his signature. So one of three things will happen. He'll either sign them, he'll either veto them, or they will become law without his signature. Right now, we fully expect him to sign it before Sunday night. His administration was very involved in particularly the last few weeks of the session as it relates to this. So we have this three-bill package. It was a long and twisty road as to how we got here. These bills were what we call smashed in many times. There were a lot of competing bills earlier in the process, but ultimately we have three bills. Assembly Bill 266, probably the main driver, deals with a whole bunch of licensing issues. 643, SB 643, same thing. And then most importantly, 243 is very cultivation intensive. This package was unveiled 10 hours before the legislature adjourned on September 11th. We were pretty familiar with about 85% of what is now in these bills, but there's about 15% of the package that we did not see, did not anticipate, did not know. The legal ramifications of that remaining percentage still needs to be worked out, but I think we feel pretty comfortable as to what the bill package says. I will say also that this is an interlocking package of bills. Basically, to describe it, one bill has A, B, C, D, L, Q, and M. The other bill has R, S, T, V, A, B, and C. And then a third bill has A but no C, but has, J, G, I, and also X. It's a very convoluted bill. Unless you have trouble sleeping at night, I wouldn't spend a lot of time trying to read this thing. It's very, very convoluted. Again, why we provided you a reference chart. It's much easier to look at the reference chart in particular issues that you might care about. So to talk about the key aspects of a number of things, let me turn it over to my colleague Karen, and then we'll continue this conversation.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the board. Thank you again for inviting us here today to talk about this legislative package. And I'm going to be covering the key components that Paul briefly describes related to our four priority policy issues. So starting with local control, this particular slide cites all the various, the four sections that we succeeded in getting local control addressed. And one thing I'd like to say is that when we were working on the legislation towards the end of the session, we were heavily pressured to just include one broad-based anti-preemption provision in the package. And we said, no way to that. We felt that local control provisions must be spread out through the legislative package, not only because of the complexity of the issues that were being addressed, but also to protect counties from being sued, or at the very least to mitigate any sort of litigation that you experience. The next four slides actually cite the specific local control sections. This particular slide just specifies that nothing in the new law supersedes local authority. And this would cover all local ordinances, whether it relates to law enforcement or your zoning requirements. The next section cites a particular provision of the Constitution. It specifies that cities and counties can impose additional requirements on cannabis-related activities, and that the state can impose, the state imposes minimum standards, but counties can actually impose far stricter standards if they so choose. Now, I should say that this section and the prior section are provisions of the law that we feel that a county could rely upon to defend a ban. The next section just emphasizes that the new law or any new regulations established cannot preempt local authority. And then lastly, we have a provision from AB 243, the cultivation bill, that specifies that, or it ensures that licensees comply with local rules. And Paul is actually going to be talking later on about a provision in that bill that's a bit of a glitch. Then, as far as other aspects of the package, and a huge priority issue for us was the ability for counties to impose, as Paul mentioned, to provide counties with explicit taxing authority. This provision, as he indicated, was included to ensure that counties can avoid litigation to whatever extent possible. And one thing that he did mention that counties, when they want to impose such a tax, that they would have to comply with Proposition 26 and 218. So the voters would actually have the final say on any new taxes. The package also allows counties to tax delivery transactions, and to also, it also explicitly states that counties continue to retain their existing authority to impose fees and other taxes. So one of the main primary purposes of the bill was to establish a strict licensing scheme. Those provisions are kind of spread out through the legislative package, but this particular section actually does away with the collective model and instead states that the state must issue a license for cannabis activity to occur, and local agencies or the cannabis licensee must also get a authorization from the local authorities as well, and that could be through a permit or some type of local license. So you can't do one without the other. You must have a state license and a local license. Then we have the environmental enforcement provisions. And I was talking to some folks in the audience earlier that one of the huge issues facing counties are the environmental impacts caused by cultivation activities. So the provisions in a couple of the bills, actually the McGuire bill and Wood bill, address the environmental impacts, brings cultivation into the environmental regulatory scheme that other industries are subject to, for example, ag crops. These regulations will deal with waste discharge requirements, with any sort of water diversions that are occurring as a result of the cannabis or cultivation activity. And what it also does is it requires the California Department of Food and Ag to establish regulations and a licensing structure for dealing with cultivation activity. So this is something definitely that you'll want your ag commissioners to keep an eye on. And then, of course, the bill sets forth various cultivation standards. It includes various categories for different types of cultivation activities, everything from dealing with indoor-outdoor cultivation to specialty indoor-outdoor cultivation to small cultivation activities. So, and then as far as the funding side of it, the bills also specified that any sort of fine and penalty revenues can be dedicated to state and local environmental enforcement activities. And then another provision that CSAC and RCRC insisted on was the establishment of a grant program in which cities and counties can access grant funding to implement environmental enforcement and other regulatory actions related to the environmental impacts of cultivation. So I think that's it, and Paul is going to talk a little bit about the exemptions and other aspects of the bill.
I forgot to mention San Benito has the honor of being the first Paul and Karen Roadshow on this. So we're you could look at it as a guinea pig, or you can look at it as, hey, hooray, we're here. Again, really appreciate having the opportunity to be here. Karen did a great job of covering those things. Want to talk about the issue of exemptions from licensure, because it's really important that that counties be aware of these provisions. There's something that Karen and I fought very, very hard towards the end of the legislative calendar when this part was being debated. But the long and short of it is there are two license exemption categories on the state licensing side, and those are for personal grow exemptions and patient caregiver exemptions. And I think you're familiar, as I went ahead and looked at your ordinance proposal, you speak to, I believe, both of these as it relates to at the local level. These are provisions that are exempt for these group of folks at the state level. That does not mean they are exempt at the local level.
Yeah, and that's what we try to do with our ordinance was, to be very clear on that. And what we incorporated into it is that on the personal exemption and the caregiver exemption, that they be allowed 12 plants. Is that still the standard at the state, or is that determined at the local level?
It's determined at the local level. The state is very silent on plant counts and quantity as it relates to personal exemptions or personal grows. On the patient caregiver side, it's no more than 5 patients. And you can see we put a doctor and 5 patients.
Okay.
We did that on purpose. So to be exempt from the state licensing requirements as a patient caregiver, you can provide care and grows for no more than 5. But it's silent as it relates to how you would be done at the local level. That is totally your prerogative.
Right. And one last question, Madam Chair, on this issue anyway. We're coming in a little bit late, I think. San Diego County, a lot of other counties have been working on their local ordinances quite a bit longer than we have. And what are other counties using as a plant exemption on the personal and caregiver side?
I'm not as familiar with those aspects, but keep in mind counties are all over the map with respect to what they're doing. So they may not feel a need to address it in the manner you have. It's not to say that there aren't. I'm just not familiar with them. But again, I'm looking at it the broad context. I don't know, Karen, if you have any insights as well on that.
No, I would just agree with Paul that, we represent all 58 counties, and they all seem to be doing something different. So I think actually that brings to mind that maybe we need to do some kind of chart that shows what all the different counties are doing. So,
okay.
Sorry.
Oh, that's quite all right. Thank you.
And I would say you're really not that far behind. There are a number of counties in both of our organizations that still don't have anything, that are still very, very silent on this stuff. And obviously you have some counties that are way ahead and led the way in litigation. So, this is actually perfect timing for you. But getting back to, again, local control, I want to reemphasize this. Local control applies to those that are exempt. So as your ordinance would do. And that's very, very, very important. This provision is buried This provision is buried. You really have to search for this provision. It's in, actually, it is not in AB 266. It's in AB 243, to be honest. But it is there. And the previous versions, I think, as Karen mentioned, we asked for a lot of local control provisions. We only got, the main 4 that you saw that Karen went through. We were in a big fight as to how much local control we would have over personal grows and patient caregiver grows. This is the best we could come up with. Some key must-knows. As Karen said, this is a dual licensing scheme. You will have to issue a license at the local level and at the state level in order to operate. Again, dual licensing scheme. This was never really the county's preference, to be frank. Counties didn't necessarily want a dual licensing scheme. That's not to say we opposed it, but it was never our preference. It was a huge issue for cities. Cities wanted to make sure that there would be a dual licensing and a dual enforcement scheme. What the cities ultimately got was a dual licensing scheme, but not necessarily a dual enforcement scheme, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But nevertheless, it's a dual licensing scheme. You will have an obligation to enter into this conversation for folks who want to cultivate or have a dispensary or have a manufacturing facility or whatnot. But the key for you is that cultivation must commence at the local level. Cultivation licenses must commence at the local level. Again, that does not necessarily mean you have to allow cultivation. Again, you can ban, as most of your ordinance does, particularly outdoors. You still have that prerogative, but if you are going to have licensing, you start it first, then the state must follow. It's very, very, very important. The other important thing is mobile deliveries. Mobile deliveries are allowed unless prohibited. You got to be very, very clear on that. Mobile deliveries are allowed unless prohibited, and they have to be prohibited by ordinance. So one of the things I would counsel to you as you are looking at doing an ordinance, I assume you probably have a dispensary ordinance that may speak to bans, but if you're opening up all of this, you might want to contemplate getting this addressed sooner than later. We fought very hard on this. This is not one of the things that we had the most success. We still obviously have some local control here. We wanted mobile deliveries to have much, much tighter reins, and particularly technology applications, what we like to call the Uberization of pot or something to that notion. We wanted those in a licensing scheme. We did not succeed in that. This is the best we got. But I would again encourage you to really look at this. Question comes about timing. The bill, if signed, takes effect January 1, 2016. The licensing requirements for timing don't kick in for another 2 years. But depending on which council you rely on, the mobile deliveries piece could kick in sooner than later. We are advising counties to go forward sooner rather than later with their mobile deliveries restrictions if that's the pleasure of the jurisdiction.
Madam Chair, if I may, real important points here that you're making. On the mobile deliveries, is there a limit as far as what could be delivered or be in possession? And who licensed that? Is it, the state, or, how does that work?
So those are all excellent questions, Supervisor Patello. The dispensing entity would have to be licensed. Think of it kind of as a pharmacy, old traditional pharmacy delivery. So those people would have to be licensed. You have to originate out of a dispensary, and so that dispensary has to be licensed. The issue is where does that fit in when you're crossing jurisdictions? I do not know if Hollister or San Juan Bautista has a dispensary, but let's just assume they are allowed in those jurisdictions. It is legal that right now that a jurisdiction in Hollister, if they allow it, could have a mobile delivery to someone in San Juan Bautista going to Hollister or Hollister going to San Juan Bautista. Unless you act, that delivery would also be permitted in the unincorporated area, assuming those jurisdictions go ahead and sanction them. So there's a fair amount of local control here, and answer your question of who licenses. Yes, you need a state license. That state license has to conform to the locals. And on the issue of mobile deliveries, those jurisdictions have to say something, or else it's pretty much laissez-faire as it goes to mobile deliveries. Cities have the option to enforce state standards. I mentioned a moment ago about this issue of dual enforcement versus dual licensing. Against the cities really wanted to have a dual enforcement scheme, meaning that that jurisdictions would be the sole primary enforcing bodies. Ultimately, the legislature did not give them that. But what they did give them is these clauses which allow a city to petition the state for enforcement of those standards, those state standards. Why is this important to counties? It's important to counties for a couple reasons. First of all, we envision, particularly on the issue of dispensaries, that counties will be involved in that enforcement because counties have environmental health directors. It's county personnel that goes in and inspects, even in a city, certain restaurants or certain licensing entities. So counties could be dragged into that conversation whether they like it or not. So this was very, very important for us to keep tabs on. This provision does not allow a city basically to rip you off, basically to put it mildly. In other words, if the city of Hollister were to allow dispensaries and require inspections of those dispensaries by county personnel, those costs would have to be borne by the city. Furthermore, if, let's say, you had a contract with the city of Hollister, and again, I'm just using these as hypothetical situations, if you had existing contracts with the city of Hollister to provide various environmental services, and now marijuana comes into that, those contracts must remain in place as they are. They don't get to, quote unquote, pile on to that contract. And you will see that if you pull up 19316B, you will see that it's clearly written. The other important aspect of this is, do counties have this enforcement role? And we would argue that they don't have it explicitly, but under local control, they may be able to secure it. That's basically what we have been told by councils on this. We're not aware of many counties that will want to embrace this. It's a lot of work. We do expect a few large cities will undertake this, predominantly on the dispensary side, not necessarily the cultivation side. But it is a tool afforded to them. Any questions before I turn it over again to Karen on other aspects?
One question on the enforcement.
I'm sorry?
Maybe you are going to the enforcement side of it as far as who is expected to enforce it from the state.
It depends who your licensing agency is, but by and large, there's an umbrella organization at Department of Consumer Affairs, the Office of Medical Marijuana Regulation. That's the primary body. But the code is littered with a variety of other references, including Department of Pesticide Review, California Department of Food and Agriculture. I think even the CHP is referenced in there on some of the transportation stuff. So there's a variety of state agencies who are involved in this. I do see here my next slide, local role in enforcement. There is some role in the localities on the area of examining the financial records of operators, as well as coordinating enforcement with other state agencies, i.e. those licensing agencies, probably Department of Justice, et cetera, et cetera. But again, back to that slide I just showed you on city enforcement. That's basically the ability of a city to take over the enforcement of the entire statute scheme, which is slightly different than what we're talking about here, where there's some limited local enforcement obligations. Again, this is our first roadshow, so we're trying to time this properly here. Just a quick thing, background checks, licensing restrictions. There are restrictions explicitly in this package about who can apply and obtain licenses. There is a DOJ background check, and then there are a variety of criminal statutes referenced as to who can obtain these licenses. The question becomes, can locals also, counties more importantly, also impose further restrictions and further background check criteria? And the answer is probably yes. Obviously, that was not necessarily contemplated in this package. Again, probably yes. What we would most likely see if a county did that is you probably would be sued, and you probably would have some litigation on that. But nevertheless, we probably believe you could prevail. Okay. I will turn it over to Karen to cover some other points.
So very briefly on these other relevant aspects of the legislative package, because counties are employers, we thought it was very important to include a provision that would allow employers to adopt policies relative to employee use of marijuana. We wanted to make sure that counties don't run crosswise with the federal law, specifically the Drug-Free Workplace Act. And so we got that provision in there. If a county does violate that law, you can lose federal funding. So you do have the ability to impose employer restrictions. Then we also have transportation standards and pesticide standards, which are also addressed in the legislative package. Both of these will primarily be addressed in the state regulatory process, so that's where all the details will be worked out. Regarding the transportation aspects of the bill, transporters must be licensed, and they also have to prepare detailed manifests, and cities and counties are allowed to inspect those manifests. And then regarding the pesticide standards, those will be developed by the Department of Pesticide Regulation in consultation with the State Water Resources Control Board. And then Paul is going to talk about cross-ownership issues and the others.
You know, before we move on with the pesticide standards, is that including for small cultivation operations, personal or indoor type of, everything is of the same standard?
I think they would have to comply with whatever existing non-cannabis kind of ag operation would have to comply with. That's my understanding.
Okay.
So comply with existing law relative to pesticide use.
All right, because I think even backyard gardeners have to comply with existing state pesticide use laws.
Right, right. Well, in the regulatory process, they will be discussing what types of pesticides you can or cannot use. So it will be very much modeled after the existing process with the exclusion of the federal government's involvement.
And I would add, Supervisor Patello, on that too. I would encourage for personal grows, because I think that's what you were alluding to as well, that again, if you're going to allow for personal grows, you tie that into your ordinance, some type of standards to make it very clear if for some reason the state isn't as comprehensive about that.
Okay.
Talk very, very briefly about these three items: cross-ownership restrictions, mandatory distribution, and removal of C4. Cross-ownership of restrictions. This is the area of the law we tried to put in place to minimize vertical integration and vertical control. Basically, having one large dominant market player own all aspects of the industry and the industry practices. So you cannot hold more than two license categories. The bill specifies in rather lengthy detail a bunch of licensing categories: a cultivation licensing category, a transport, a dispensary, manufacturer, et cetera. And so the law is clear that you can't hold more than two of those licenses at one time to prevent, again, vertical integration. With all prohibitions, there are exceptions to the rule. There are several exceptions. In the interest of time, I won't go into them in great detail unless you want to. But just note that there are some significant restrictions on who can own the license, when, and how. Also, this is a mandatory distribution scheme, meaning all of the cultivated products that come off the cultivation entity, farm, warehouse, whatever it is, have to go through a distribution system. And that was done for a variety of reasons, but one of the main reasons is it's easy to collect taxes when you have one distributing entity. That was modeled after alcoholic beverage law. You will have thousands and thousands of cultivators in this state. You may only have dozens of distributors in this state. And so those distributors, if we move to a statewide tax, which we'll talk about in just a second, you have already in place a mandatory distribution scheme. And then finally, I don't believe this is going to be applicable to San Benito based on your actions later in this board meeting, but there is a provision in the bill, what we call the C4 provision, which speaks to counties who do not have cultivation ordinances. Because your board is going to adopt them, you will not necessarily need to worry about this, but if for some reason you did not, you would be worried about Clause C4. This is a provision in AB 243, which again assumes an increased state role in various cultivation practices in the absence of a local ordinance. The author, Assemblyman Wood from the North Coast, has committed to removing this section of the law when the legislature reconvenes in January. Again, that's his commitment. That doesn't mean he's got a bill that's ready to be sent down to the governor tomorrow and signed, but we do have a commitment from him, so I do expect them to have this removed from the statute. Again, not a big issue for you because you obviously are undertaking that.
Paul, I have a question on the taxing by the state. Is there a plan to distribute those taxes to counties?
Yes, and I'll come to that in just a second in a slide that's coming up. Real quickly, regulatory efforts. There is two regulatory packages. One has been already adopted on the North Coast. The other was before the Central Valley Regional Water Quality Control Board on Friday in Reading. We expect Central Valley to adopt them. My understanding is San Benito is split between Central Coast and Central Valley. I think I'm right on that. But nevertheless, if your county is in some portion of the Central Valley Regional Water Quality Control Board, a whole new set of regulatory orders will be in order for cultivation grows. And these are the key elements of that regulatory package. I do expect the Central Coast and other regional water quality control boards will follow suit in time with a very similar regulatory package, which is exactly what all of these elements will contain. You will see that the regulatory package defers to county ordinances. So you cannot get a waste discharge waiver unless you comply with local county ordinances with your cultivation. And there are a variety of other aspects. Let me talk about the cultivation tax, and I'll turn it over to Karen to kind of commence the wrap-up here when we talk about the banking. So there are two bills that were introduced on the last night of session, fully intended not to be part of this package, but be considered in the 2016 legislative year. One of them is AB 1548. This would impose a cultivation tax at the state level. This is what Supervisor Barrios is speaking to. And you will see these are the tax amounts that it's proposed right now. They're on leaves, flowers, plants. They would be collected by the Board of Equalization at the distributor level quarterly, again, if this bill were to pass. The proceeds, which is what Supervisor Barrios asked for, the year you see what the monies would be spent with, locals would have an opportunity to access them. They are not necessarily dedicated, as you will see, but we would be able to petition and request them. This is in addition to what Karen talked about under the environmental enforcement. Those environmental enforcement items that Karen talked about would be funded through the fines and penalties account. This is a separate account, separate distribution. So you would have potentially two bites at the apple. And again, as Karen said, you also have the ability to enact a local tax. So theoretically, you have three bites at the funding apple for your efforts. Again, I want to stress this bill is not part of the package, has not become law. This will be considered next year. This is also a 2/3 vote bill. It's a tax increase, it's a tax levy. So you obviously need Republicans to support this in addition to Democrats. That's always a very tough thing in the legislature.
Thanks, So while everybody loves cash, it doesn't seem to be working out too well when it comes to the marijuana industry. So Assemblymember Wood has introduced a spot bill that will be addressed next year, and it's AB 1549, and it would actually set up a financial institution, a state financial institution under the Board of Equalization. The way it's written now, it would establish a California cannabis credit union, but at this point in time, there's no details, and it's something that we'll be actively following and engaging in. Oh, I didn't know I was covering the ballot measures. Okay. Well, as you know, the recreational ballot measures are being discussed. One was filed just recently. There's a couple others that are being taken very seriously. There's one that's going to be very well funded. Both CSAC and RCRC have had a chance to take a look at those and offer suggested changes specifically related to the policy principles that we've adopted. There's another measure that I think the Drug Policy Alliance is associated with. I just heard something on the news this morning that there sounds like there's a little bit of infighting amongst these proponents of these three initiatives. So if you're against recreational, the marijuana use being legalized, I guess you can hope that they continue with the infighting, because if you get a bunch of measures on a ballot measure, more than likely voters will vote no on those. So is there anything you wanted to talk about? Well, I think that's pretty much it. We'd be happy to answer any other questions. And I should mention that CSAC, RCRC, and the Urban County Caucus will be holding a webinar very soon, mid-November. I think we've landed on a date of November 18th for all county supervisors, all department heads, and whoever else from the county government that wants to participate. That's it.
Karen, on the banking part of it, because federal law, marijuana is prohibited through federal law.
Right.
The word try obviously is written that way because that you don't expect cooperation from the feds as far as the banking laws are concerned. Right.
Right now, it's just kind of, I think most of the transactions that are occurring now are cash-based. I think he has toured Colorado facilities, so I'm not exactly sure how they handled it. But yeah, it's just this sort of big unknown as far as what the feds will do. But Mr. Wood feels that it would be a good idea to get a state banking institution in place because it's getting a little unwieldy and dealing with cash transactions and dangerous.
Yeah, and this will be a very high cash operation, I'm assuming.
Very.
It is already.
Billions of dollars. Right.
Okay. Karen, thank you so much.
Sure,
Any questions
thank
of
you.
Karen before she sits down? And before I open it up to the public, Supervisor Batella?
Yeah, I just have a couple of questions, but first, I really want to thank CSAC and RCRC for taking the time for coming and presenting this information to us. As I think everybody could appreciate, this is a real complex issue and very difficult for the state as well as local jurisdictions to put in place some sort of controls. Are there any counties that you might be aware of that's just throwing up their arms and just saying, heck, we don't need any controls and just let the chips fall where they fall?
Well, there are a couple very large counties in Southern California that kind of feel that way, but I think they're probably going to be forced to have to do something because it's coming no matter what. So, but at this point in time, these counties don't have any sort of ordinances in place. They just don't want to touch it. They feel it's violating federal law. Stay out of it.
Okay, thank you very much. And, I certainly want to thank the chairman and our staff and the DA's office and the sheriff's office for participating in our draft or ordinance. And it's a lot of work, and we've looked at a lot of different counties. It's taken a lot of time, and Barbara has done a phenomenal job with our ordinance and comparing it with other counties and what they're trying to do. And it's we still have some work yet to do, But I just want to make that statement, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Supervisor Botello. And Barbara, again, Supervisor Botello is right. You've done a lot of work. We appreciate that, and you did it, with just a lot of time that was invested, knowing that this is something that we needed to do and had to start. So thank you. And thank you, Matt and Ray and anybody else that was able to help us with this. So, Ray, you have a comment?
Yeah, I wanted to convey my appreciation to Paul and Karen as well for coming out. And, I actually heard this presentation at RCRC in the CIO forum, and I thought it was very, very enlightening. There was a lot to digest, and I felt it was appropriate to make sure the board actually heard it in the public, because there's a lot to the 3 ordinances that we actually heard. So I want to thank you again. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for making the trip. Okay, Barbara, you have some information for us?
Yes. At the last meeting, the board accepted introduction and continued at today's meeting regarding the proposed cultivation ordinance. I suggested the board open it for the public comment. The recommended action is before the board, but I throw it open to the board's discussion about if it wants to take a different direction or whether it wants to take the recommended action set forth.
Thank you. I think at this time I will go ahead and open it to public comment. And Clerk of the Board, you have some speaker cards.
Yes, Madam Chair. Is it Anita Johnson or Aaron Johnson? Aaron Johnson.
Okay.
Good morning, Supervisor Barrios, members of the board. Aaron Johnson on behalf of Coastal Growers Association, which I gave you kind of a brief introduction to last time I spoke a couple weeks ago. I represent a group of people that are involved in the cultivation, manufacturing, and dispensing of cannabis, and we are completely for a legal, controlled environment that is taxed and regulated, and willing to participate on all levels in that discussion. I somewhat agree with the presentation that was just given. I thought was really informative and gives you kind of the tip of the iceberg look at what AB 243, 266, and SB 643 do for the industry. It provides a lot of state oversight as well as local oversight, and there's a lot of good things in there to provide you with local control. There's a lot of good things and a lot of work that went into that allow you to use that control beneficially to get rid of the things that you want to get rid of, which we talked about at the last meeting, which happened to be illicit grows. You have grows that are here that are legal. They will continue under the ordinance, but at the same time, we would like and I represent some of those people, we would like a seat at the table with you for further dialogue. I ask that you not take a position today on this ordinance. I think it's premature. I think that you've got a lot of information in front of you today that warrants further discussion, further inquiries into how can we merge the two concepts, prohibition of illegal activity, of truly illegal activity, things that violate the Cole memo, things like that. How do we control that and provide for legal businesses that will help fund and help with that illegal gang-related type of activity? And I think that getting together and speaking about this would be an excellent step in the right direction in doing that. In Monterey County, I've been asked to work with those that are drafting the Monterey County ordinance and provide our input on these policies. I've also been asked by the City of Greenfield to actually draft their ordinance. And so I'm very involved with this subject, and I just ask that you, before you take the step of a ban in ordinance, I actually, in hindsight, I look back at the vote that you took a couple weeks ago, and I think that a moratorium that is temporary would be better at this stage. A timeout is okay and warranted in certain circumstances, but if it's for the purpose of getting the right people together to talk about the policy, I think that's where it makes sense. And here, to get us together to the table to assist law enforcement with an understanding of what could happen with this industry under a legal environment is not only warranted, but I think it would be an excellent move forward to not create a divide on this issue, it really needs to. I think there's an opportunity for everyone to work together. There's only one group of people that won't show up here and won't weigh in on the discussion, and it's the illegal growers that you've seen. We also have.
If you could summarize, thank you.
Yeah, and thank you very much. We would like to give tours of the facilities, et cetera, and we'd be happy to do that so you see what a legal operation would look like.
Okay, Supervisor Munzer has a question.
Mr.
Yeah.
Johnson, before you sit down, I'd like to ask my fellow board members that were on the committee. I know when Supervisor Patello and I were working on the oil ordinance, we had at the table basically people that were against oil drilling and the people that were drilling oil. Did the subcommittee have, I guess, people involved in the marijuana?
Law enforcement was involved, our district attorney was involved, our county council, the two supervisors, and I'm trying to think of who else was at the table.
The chief attended one meeting.
The chief attended one meeting, chief of police.
But not so much on the marijuana, on the growing side, or
No, this was strictly on the ordinance side of it, on what their
Okay.
expectations of what we should be doing as a county to help them. That was primarily the
okay.
conversation.
Okay. And so, Mr. Johnson, I guess the question I have for you, and I think I heard the answer, but I'm just going to reiterate it. I'm hearing from you that you would be happy to sit down with the subcommittee, if we chose to, and kind of help tweak the ordinance to where it may be a little bit more manageable.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam
Thank
Chair.
you. All right, next speaker.
James C. Blocker.
Good afternoon. My name again is James Blocker, and I'm one of the owners of a property at 2025 San Juan Road, which is right there coming in on the west side of Hollister where the bridge is, and it's also where that homeless encampment is that helped kind of get it in place. And I wanted to talk just a little bit about a property owner who was approached by a group of individuals, not this gentleman, about this topic of a medical marijuana operation. And when I first listened to him politely, I walked away and basically said I'm not interested because I don't like the whole quasi-legal aspect of this thing. But I did listen to him, and upon further reflection and as time passed, certain things came to pass on that property that made me go back and look at it and reconnect with those individuals and look at it from a different perspective and a different set of opportunities. And in listening to the meeting today, I heard much about funding, liability, the homeless situation, all those issues. And those have come somewhat to coincide on that piece of property that I own. Again, I mentioned right there in the creek is a big homeless encampment, and it has caused us a lot of grief there as property owners with the tenants that I have there. And I've had some issues there, and as the last tenant now has left in part because of that issue, I've had a little bit of a difficulty in finding a new tenant, and it made me re-examine this opportunity with these folks and look into it and really listen to what they had to say. And I'm asking you also to look at this as an opportunity. What appealed to me was they were an indoor grow operation. It was very contained. They had prior experience on doing this operation. It was something we could look at. And they had already dealt with issues like water runoff, pesticides, that kind of. This is a huge issue, this whole issue of fertilizers and pesticides. And the indoor operation does present some opportunities. They also were very concerned about security. And that was for me, a huge issue because of the homeless situation sitting there next to me, which, despite all the talk, is not really going to be dealt with anytime soon. They're not going anywhere. They were interested in bringing with them a security officer that was going to be on that property from 5 p.m. basically until they opened the doors in the morning. and they were going to pay for it. I don't have many tenants who have built into their business model a $100,000 security officer, possibly even a former law enforcement officer, which would be probably pleasing for everyone. And so I just ask you to look at it as an opportunity. It's messy. There's a lot of paperwork, but it's coming like a tsunami, and you're going to have to deal with it either way. And I just ask you that you look at it also from the opportunity side, like I had to. And
Thank
so
you.
I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. No more speaker cards? Okay, anybody else from the public that would like to speak at this time? You're welcome to come up. If you could state your name, and if you have an opportunity to fill out a yellow speaker card before you leave and give it to the clerk. Thank you.
Hello, my name is J.C. Roddy. I'm part of the Coastal Growers Association with Aaron Johnson. I'm also a production manager for Central Coast Garden Products, and we make an all-natural pesticide for marijuana. In 1996, the same year that the Compassionate Care Act passed, I joined the United States Marine Corps out of Ohio, and I was put on the border of Texas and Mexico to eradicate marijuana trafficking. I know firsthand the fears we are all facing here. Our government did not ban medical marijuana then, but they merely tried to regulate it. I was part of a task force that took the life of a U.S. citizen trafficking marijuana. This was the first U.S. citizen to be killed by U.S. forces since the Kent State shootings in 1970. I ask you what it is we're trying to ban. We can all be in agreement. We're against operations like the most recent cornfield grow. And I also personally led 5 officers from local agencies into Stone Canyon a couple of years back, where they were diverting water from the Didampia Ranch for an illegal grow. Let me see here. We're discussing medical marijuana. Assemblymember Alejo discussed a bill that provides compassionate care to aid those near the end of their lives. That's giving them the choice to stop their pain and their suffering and ultimately end their life. Medical marijuana can provide some of the same effects as that Compassionate Care Act. By establishing regulations, you establish control. By banning it, it will only allow a legal market to continue to thrive. So consider what we're banning. Let's open this up for business for this county and realize there's a difference between compassionate care and cartels. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else from the public?
Good morning, everybody. My name's Ross Bennett. I represent a company that is that has definitely dealt with all these issues before. We're based out of San Jose. I have personally had the sheriff's department, the fire department, and the mayor and the deputies into my operation. We've discussed all the things that have happened before. I would really like you guys to take this opportunity to really realize what you guys are going to do here, and I really don't want you guys to keep the good people out. You guys, this is going to happen in 2016. It is on the ballot to go federally legal, state legal, excuse me, just like Colorado did. We're here to work with you guys in everywhere possible. We're a totally transparent company. I really don't think you guys have enough information to vote on what it is you guys are going to vote on today. So, if you guys have any questions for me, I've been here before. I just really thank you for the opportunity to let me speak, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other speakers?
Good afternoon, Madam and Chairpersons. My name is Elia Salinas. I'm a longtime resident of San Benito County. I've been here for over 25 years. I had a totally different attitude of this in the early 80s. I was actually affiliated in law enforcement. I worked undercover, and I had a completely different attitude now that I've seen what actually this medical marijuana can actually do. There are black markets out there. There are legal markets out there, and I think you should try to slow down this moratorium so you guys can get educated on it. I would be more than happy to accompany you to some grows, legal grows. The majority of the grows that I've seen from Northern California all the way down to San Diego are the cleanest. There's no pesticides. They're completely environmentally friendly. And if you haven't already had a tour of a dispensary, I would like to accompany you to one so that you can actually get a personal view of what is going on in this industry. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other speakers from the public before I bring it back to the board? Okay, I will go ahead and close the public comment of this item and bring it back for discussion. We'll start with Supervisor Rivas, then Supervisor Botello.
Sure, Madam Chair. I don't want to sound like a broken record. I think I said my piece last time that this was on the agenda, but I do want to highlight, I want to thank Paul and Karen for their presentation because I think they confirmed, at least for me, the complexity of the legislation that was adopted by the state legislature and which we anticipate the governor to sign. But I do want to note that this legislation, at the time, at our last meeting, we had just learned about it, that it was passed, and all the articles I read, they pointed to the fact that this legislation was groundbreaking. It's groundbreaking because it provides our state a regulatory framework in dealing with marijuana, because there's no question that marijuana, there's no denying the fact that when you talk about marijuana, the issues surrounding marijuana, this is an evolving debate. It's an evolving issue. This is the first state. We're the first state that passed the legal use of marijuana for the medicinal purposes in the mid-'90s. Now, over 20 states have legalized marijuana for the medicinal purposes, let alone the recent state approvals in Colorado, and I believe is it Oregon or Washington, where they have the recreational use is legal now. And so, it's unfortunate that the Sheriff's Department isn't here because it seems like they're the ones that are really moving this issue. But I have a lot of issues with this ordinance. But I think that what this ordinance in particular, I've had a hard time, buying into learning about all these illegal operations in our county that I recently learned about in our last agenda, at our previous meeting where the Sheriff's Department, they had a presentation that highlighted the illegal operations that have occurred in our county. But I'm having a tough time, making the correlation between this ordinance and preventing those illegal operations. Because I think, if anything, what this ordinance is that we have before us today, it's a ban, is what it is. Not taking into the consideration, a statewide initiative next year that could possibly make marijuana a recreational use legal here in the state. But moving forward, with this with this ordinance, it essentially is a ban. And what I have a hard time, trying to understand is I believe that this ordinance is going to promote the continuance of this countywide tax-free illegal drug trade right here in San Benito County. That's why I honestly believe that this ordinance represents. Because when, moving forward, for me, in dealing with this issue here in San Benito County, it's regulation. Regulation and carefully studying the issues surrounding marijuana as a community and as a state is the approach I think we need to take as a county. I think both from a public safety standpoint and from an economic one, certainly. We talk so much about revenues and about doing more for our economy. I think this is one approach that we need to take. We need to approach this very carefully and study it. When we talked about fracking, we studied that for 6 years, 2 months before we came out with an ordinance. We tend to take our time on things, but it seems like this has been rushed a little bit here. And so with that said, I think that this issue, it deserves greater transparency, and what it deserves is honest public debate. This is a big issue, and so this ordinance could have some consequences moving forward from a public safety standpoint, in my opinion, and from an economic one. I think that the process surrounding this decision, especially the creation of this particular ordinance, has been done behind closed doors with limited community input and the subsequent appropriate the debate that is supposed to occur after these types of issues. And in the past, we've exhausted when it comes to transparency, especially with fracking. We appointed the committee. When you talk about the fire contract, when we didn't agree as a board, but we went back into the committee process, met with the city, and it took us a year before we hashed out our differences, but we made sure to do that. And I think we need to, this issue, when we talk about marijuana, the impacts it's going to have on our community, it deserves that same kind of careful attention. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay. Supervisor Patella?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. And, I've worked on this ad hoc committee, and I think it was been pretty well demonstrated that this is a very complex issue. And there's been, a comparison of a number of counties and work to compile the provisions that we put into our ordinance proposal. With that said, I don't necessarily disagree with Supervisor Rivas in the fact that maybe we should take a little bit more time to craft a little bit more well-rounded ordinance. What I had in mind entering into this process was strictly the curbing of the illegal actions in our community. I'm concerned about gangs, what motivates them, and their impact for safety in our schools and our communities. And a lot of it has to do with illicit drugs. Now, with that said, there's a lot of activity at the state level, and as it was brought to us today, and I'm not afraid to go back and try to make this ordinance work. I think it's a great idea to sit down with Mr. Johnson, et cetera, and folks that made that offer, and educate myself a little bit more on what they are actually doing and how it fits in what the state is trying to accomplish, as well as how we should control and regulate the activity in our own county. And if it takes a little bit more time, it takes a little bit more time. But I'd rather come back, Madam Chair, and work a little bit more on this, have a 5-0 vote of this board, which to me is not so much a 5-0 vote us getting along as much what it represents is unity in the community. And that's what I want to try to accomplish. But it's very, very important to me that we give, law enforcement the tools that they're asking for, which has brought and motivated us to develop this ordinance, and also, these type of operations comply with state laws and local laws, and I think we could do a little bit better job moving forward. Thank you.
Okay. Supervisor Munzer?
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Supervisor De La Cruz.
I know several years ago, the director of the local BLM office was giving me a tour of the Clear Creek area before it was closed up. And overhead was an airplane flying, just circling it, almost circling us. And we looked at it, and he goes, "Oh, that's our patrol plane that we contracted to identify the illegal grows that were down there in the BLM land of Clear Creeks." And when I was finding out that those groves were moving up here into the more populated areas, I was concerned. And I thought this ordinance that we were trying to craft was dealing with those ordinance and allowing for the medical marijuana to be grown by the people that needed to use it. After we passed this ordinance, I've received many phone calls and I've never been around marijuana. I probably would only recognize the plant because I've seen it in so many pictures, but I don't know anything about growing marijuana. And so I assumed that growing it indoors was pretty much the same as growing outdoors. I have since found out that it's much more difficult to grow it indoors. It takes a higher level of expertise to grow it indoors than just to grow it outdoors. And so I have concerns about that aspect of the ordinance probably needs to be looked at. I too, as Supervisor Patello said, I want to give our sheriff and our law enforcement people the tools they need, but I also don't want to eliminate the ability of the people that need this for medical reasons to be able to grow it. I know, going back to the oil ordinance, we were meeting in the morning and working on a draft. We would meet again in the afternoon to work on a draft. And we worked on it for a long time. And we came up with a pretty good ordinance. The people of San Benito County didn't think we went quite far enough with it, and it ended up going to a vote of the people. I don't know if this will go that same direction. It could, but I do think we're not quite there yet with this ordinance. It needs to be looked at, and I appreciate the offer from Mr. Johnson and the others, and I would request that the subcommittee would be willing to reconvene and to discuss this with them and see if we can iron out some of the issues with this ordinance. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you. Supervisor De La Cruz?
Yes, thank you, Madam. First of all, I'd like to really say thank you to Sherry. I'm sorry, I apologize, Barba, because there have been times I will call you around 9 or 10 o'clock and ask you to explain this language to me, and you have the patience to do more research and call me the next day in the morning with an answer. I didn't agree with some of your responses, but at least you were honest and you were straightforward in providing a good service to the community. Thank you very much. I do appreciate it. I also appreciate Supervisor Patello's and our Madam Chair for doing the work, on a compassionate level and on a commitment level. And thank you very much. I do appreciate that. I also appreciate comments from the public. I understand where they're coming from. I also appreciate the Sheriff Department and the DA with their concerns and their requests for added tools. However, I don't feel that this is a tool that they can use to control that illegal section of our community or members of the public. However, I do feel that this is more of a stop, more of a moratorium on marijuana, and I just for one, cannot support this ordinance. However, in the public's best interest, I would agree with some of the points Supervisor Rivas has said, is that we need more public input. We need to have a series of meetings. We need to understand that business component. We need to understand that potential of revenue that we can solve. Imagine revenue to fix our roads, adding more personnel to our county staff. We need to examine and do a due diligence on that process. I also believe that we need to create a committee. I'm not too sure, with all due respect, Madam Chair, fellow Supervisor Patel, that the committee should be the same members. I think maybe it should be two supervisors, one from the current committee and one from one of either supervisors, but Munzer or Rivas or myself should be part of that, and then go through a full-blown public debate discussion. I believe that, and go through the process and slow down, because I honestly feel that come November of next year, we might actually have another position. And I don't want to do all these regulations and rules and put them in place with the chapters, and then knowing that the public gave us their wish, and then change back our position. I don't want to do that. So I would prefer that we go through that process, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you, Supervisor De La Cruz. My comments are that, yes, this has been and was initiated because of a law enforcement issue. Supervisor Botello and I experienced some grows that were very illegal, very illicit, very they contaminated the ground. So that was our compelling reason for bringing this forward. I don't think it matters what regulations you have. You're not going to stop the illicit operations. Law enforcement is going to have to deal with this no matter what regulations we have, because outlaws are going to be out there no matter what. The state is letting us keep, per this legislation, our local control, which I think is really, really important. So my take on this is, why should we wait to see what happens at the state level? Why don't we do what's best for San Benito County? It doesn't matter what the state decides. We have local control, and we can make our own regulations and ordinances to protect our environment, to protect our children, to protect neighborhoods, families. So I still stand very strong on that position. Right now, the legalization of marijuana for recreation is probably going to happen. It's out there. It's going to be in place come next November. I have no doubt. But do you realize that it isn't legal yet for recreation, but yet at this moment, there are 1.5 pounds of marijuana being cultivated, produced for every woman, man, and child in the state of California. So you tell me that people are waiting for it to be for recreational uses? No, it's a very lucrative operation, and they're using it for more than medical marijuana, because I can tell you that 1.5 pounds for every woman, man, and child, it goes way beyond medical use. So they're calling it the green rush. The green rush is here. So it's increased, and here it is. It's not legal yet. It's increased 100 to 104% in the last 3 years. Is there concern? It is for me. I have children. I have grandchildren. I care about the kids in this community. I care about the health of our community. So for me, we passed a general plan that was agriculture. That is what we're pushing. We're pushing vegetables, nuts, fruits. I never envisioned that even though marijuana, yes, it is an ag plant, that it would be part of our general plan. We were pushing for economic development. I never envisioned that we were going to use or maybe expect that marijuana was going to be our driving force, that this is where we were going to make money for this community to be more economically stable. I envision tourism. I envision green energy, biotech. I support this ordinance as it stands, and I'm not going to stay away from it or go away from it, but I'm willing, if we pass it today, to revisit if we're compelled at a future time. But for now, for me, I felt that this ordinance needed to happen. It needed to happen sooner than later, because we need to be in a position to regulate right now, not tomorrow, not next year. So thank you. So I'll bring it back for a vote, a motion.
Madam Chair, I'll move. I'm not sure if this is a motion or more of a recommendation, but I would recommend that we go back to the committee process, that we look to revise this ordinance, that we look to make it more of an inclusive process, working with our local law enforcement, with our local county staff, but also with those that have interest in the marijuana industry. That we invite them to the table, and that maybe we plan a couple of some public workshops, whether it be evening workshops, afternoon workshops, but that we really try to include the public in the process of creating an ordinance that will work for everybody.
Okay.
I'll second that motion, Madam Chair.
Motion and a second. Is there further discussion? I just want to say that I will not support that, but not because I don't feel that we need more public input. It's just that I felt that our ordinance was fine as it stood. So any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No? 4-1.
The clerk of the board would like to note that this ordinance number is going to be reserved, so we just won't use it for a different ordinance.
Say that again, Barbara?
The ordinance number, it will just stay on the books as with no ordinance attached
That's
to
no
it.
ordinance.
Yeah.
Okay. And what I also would like to do is bring back for a an agenda item to create the committee, and we can do that on the October 20th meeting. Okay? Any other recommendations?
Madam Chair, yes. Can we also ask the public if those who wish to participate at the committee level that we start accepting applications or names of interest?
Okay. Yeah, and we can do that when we bring that agenda item back on October 20th. We can include that as part of the invitation.
Okay, just a Brown Act point. It's one thing to create an ad hoc subcommittee. That's not subject to the Brown Act. But if you're going to create a committee that's going to include members of the public, that will be a Brown Act committee that will have to be agendized.
I think we probably will have to go in that direction.
I'm sorry.
It will be an ad hoc committee that will invite the public. Therefore, it will have to follow the Brown Act rules.
Well,
and
if the committee is composed of board members and members of the public, then it becomes a Brown Act committee. If the committee is composed only of 2 board members, then it's an ad hoc committee. It's not subject to the Brown Act. You can meet like you have in the past with members of the public. But Supervisor Dela Cruz has talked about sending out an application for people of the public to become committee members. That's a little bit different.
Well, I think what we'll do then is discuss what that ad hoc committee will look like on the 20th of October. This way we can come back with additional ideas and thoughts. So, okay. I think that we're done. I'll entertain a motion. Oh, Barbara,
if anybody, the public that spoke, wants to submit their contact information, I know that they already gave their name, but if they want to give emails, addresses, and things like that so that we can let them know of any meetings in the future, they can submit that as well.
Okay, very good. So I'll entertain a motion to adjourn our meeting.
Second.
Motion and a second. Our meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everybody, for attending this meeting.